Hello everyone, welcome to our last week of this J-term course. Today we addressed issues that are relevant to students with communication disorders, and based on your posts submitted, I noticed that you addressed almost all the objectives that we had for today. The only objective that I didn't see that was addressed was understanding the history of communication disorders. Abigail's and Jennifer's resource talked about definitions and classifications of communication disorders. In her content, Delane also talked about her resource as a resource that addressed definitions of communication disorders. Although without the link, I'm not able to see what the resource contains. Brittany talked about poverty issues, which targets the third objective, identification of causes of communication disorders. Whereas Rachel, Christine, Sophie, and Adria, they hit characteristics of communication disorders because Rachel talked about apraxia, Christine about articulation disorders, Sophie about speech disorders, Adria about stuttering. Megan addressed the objective about identification issues, whereas the last two objectives were addressed by Audrey, Taylor, and Lindsay. Ashley and Nate also addressed issues that are relevant for teachers because the use of alternative and augmentative communication, and also Ashley's resource, which identified a very effective app for students with communication disorders. As you have noticed in this module, we are talking about communication disorders. However, it is important to understand that under IDEA, students with communication difficulties are labeled as students with speech or language impairment. Children are eligible for services in this category if they have a communication disorder such as stuttering, impaired articulation, a language impairment, or a voice impairment that adversely affects a child's educational performance. Therefore, it is understandable why we focus on speech, language, and communication. First, it is important to differentiate the concepts speech, language, and communication. While speech is the expression of language with sounds, essentially the oral modality for language, language is a rule-based method of communication involving the comprehension and use of signs and symbols by which ideas are represented. And finally, communication is the exchange of ideas, information, thoughts, and feelings. When working with students with communication disorders, we have to expect that these students will have problems in two main areas, speech and language. Students who have speech disorders, they usually might have problems with articulation, fluency, or voice. Articulation disorders are the most common types of speech disorders. As noticed in the resources that you have posted here, Christine and Sophie, the problems that these videos emphasized were problems such as omissions, substitutions, additions, and distortions. Another type of problems that falls under speech disorders is fluency disorder. Students with fluency disorders usually have problems with rhythm and timing of speech. Stuttering is one of the most common fluency disorders. Another group of disorders that falls under speech disorders is voice disorders. Usually these are the students who will have problems with quality or use of their own voice that results from disorders of the larynx. As for language disorders, the chapter in communication disorders on your textbook was very informative on what is really a language disorder. So if you recall the components of language, which are the 5 components: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Students with language problems, they will have delay or difficulties with mastery in one or more of any of these areas. Rachel's resource talked about apraxia of speech. Apraxia of speech actually is a neurological phonologic disorder that results from impairment of the capacity to select, program, or execute the positioning of the speech muscles to produce speech sounds. So how comes that apraxia of speech is a phonological disorder and not an articulation disorder? A phonological disorder is defined as abnormal organization of the phonologic system or a significant deficit in speech production or perception. A child has a phonological disorder as opposed to an articulation disorder if he or she has the ability to produce a given sound and does so correctly in some instances, but fails to produce the sound correctly at other times. So apraxia of speech is one of those phonological disorders. Other disorders, based on the components of the language, we have morphological disorder, syntactical deficit, semantic disorder, and pragmatic difficulties. One last problem that your textbook doesn't really talk about, but I noticed that some of your resources here talks about, is central auditory processing disorder. Central auditory processing disorder is actually considered controversy in the field of language disorders. Most experts agree that this is a problem in the processing of sound, which is not attributed to hearing loss or intellectual capacity. What that means is that central auditory processing involves how we use and interpret auditory information. In children with central auditory processing disorder, these deficits are not the result of hearing loss, because hearing is usually normal. These children demonstrate problems with auditory figure ground, so they have difficulty attending to a speaker when there is noise in the background. They have problems with auditory memory, auditory discrimination, which means that they have problems hearing the difference between similar sounds or words. They have also problems with auditory attention, which means that they have problems maintaining listening focus, and auditory cohesion. For example, drawing inferences from conversations, understanding riddles, comprehending verbal math problems, and so forth. Many of you found resources that talked about teaching strategies for students with speech impairments, and these are nice suggestions here. How to help students with communication disorders in school. This is another great resource to refer to. And of course, Do2Learn, which is a great website that talks about different strategies for each group of students. However, I wanted to add specifically what strategies you can use for students with central auditory processing problems, since that is not specifically addressed in your resources. In 2015, Gergula, in his Special Education in Contemporary Society book, listed several suggestions on how to support these students. One approach focuses on training certain auditory and listening skills, such as auditory discrimination. For example, telling the difference between P's and B's, localization of sound, sequencing sounds, or identifying a target sound in a noisy background. Training these skills in isolation, however, may not help a child understand complex language. For example, might not understand teachers' instructions. Therefore, another approach concentrates on teaching more functional language skills, vocabulary, grammar, conversational skills, and also uses of strategies such as visual aids, repeating directions to facilitate the processing of language. Changes at home and in the classroom can also help a child with central auditory processing problems. Seating, it helps the child to focus and maintain attention. You might want to select seating that is away from auditory and visual distractions. A seat close to the teacher and the blackboard and away from the window and the door may be very helpful. Setting, try to reduce external visual and auditory distractions. A large display of posters or cluttered bulletin board can be distracting. A study carol in the room may help. Earplugs may be useful to block distracting noise from a heater or air conditioner, the pencil sharpener, or talking in the hallway. In order to improve the listening environment, we might also want to try using different devices that transmit the teacher's voice directly to the student's ear while blocking out background noise. And this relates to the post that Nate and also Ashley posted this for this module. So incorporating technology to help students improve their communication abilities. With speaking, try to gain the child's attention before giving directions. Speak slowly and clearly, but do not over-exaggerate speech. Use simple and brief directions. Give directions in a logical, time-ordered sequence. Use words that make the sequence clear, such as first, next, and finally. Use visual aids and write instructions to supplement spoken information. Emphasize key words when speaking or writing, especially when presenting new information. Pre-instructions with emphasis on the main ideas to be presented may be also very effective. Use gestures that clarify information. Vary loudness to increase attention. Check comprehension by asking the child questions or asking for a brief summary after key ideas have been presented. Paraphrase instructions and information in shorter and simpler sentences rather than just repeating them. Encourage the child to ask questions for further clarifications. Make instructional transitions clear. Review previously learned material. Recognize periods of fatigue and give breaks as necessary. Avoid showing frustration when a child misunderstands a message. And also avoid asking the child to listen and write at the same time. For children with severe central auditory processing problems, you might want to ask a peer to take notes or ask the teacher to provide notes. Audio or video recording classes is also very effective for this group of students. In conclusion, I think that your resources provided relevant information on today's module, and I look forward to read your posts on tomorrow's module, students with hearing impairment. Thank you.